The next topic is Zachman Framework. A Zachman Framework was developed by John Zachman in 1987, and he basically wrote a paper about it. The first Zachman Framework was initially called Information System Architecture. The first original Zachman Framework was defined by Zachman actually in 1984. According to Zachman, he defined the Zachman framework as the total set of descriptive representations, artifacts, or models relevant for describing the knowledge infrastructure of an enterprise. So here you can see that it's basically about models which are relevant to a certain audience. Okay, the Zachman framework for enterprise architecture is an ontology or structure according to which an enterprise can be explicitly defined and described. The keyword here is ontology. So if you Google ontology, basically ontology is about classifying. It's about grouping of things. In Zachman, the groupings are the models. You group the models based on a certain point of view. Okay, so when you group models to a certain point of view, therefore that models becomes relevant to that point of view. And the Zachman framework for enterprise architecture, or we call it a Zachman framework, is both a taxonomy because you group the models, and also it's a classifying structure because you're grouping these models to a certain view, and there's a relationship between this one group of model to another group of model. Okay. Okay, the thing about Zachman framework is that it does not only apply to enterprise architecture, but it can also apply to other domains such as cars or buildings. This is because of the idea of Zachman is about classifying artifacts or models to suit a certain audience or to a certain view. So therefore, regardless of what domain you are in, it is always going to be about coming up with or developing models that is relevant. And also, there is no methodology associated with Zachman. Zachman is about, it totally defines the boundary of the scope in your EA, in managing the information in EA. Okay, so there's no steps in doing it, there's no process in doing it. So whatever process or steps that you are adopting for your EA project, it does not really or it does not affect the framework that much. So you can use Zachman framework in any methodology. Okay. Next, okay, we're going to go into what Zachman framework really is. Basically, if you Google Zachman framework, right, you can see that Zachman framework is in the form of a table. So when it is in the form of a table, you would have the rows and you would have the columns. So how many rows and how many columns are there? There are 6 columns and 6 rows. So altogether, there are 36 cells. The rows, okay, the rows represents the perspectives. There are 6 perspectives represent the organizational audience perspectives in order to fill the business of the enterprise. So these perspectives, for example, can be from the planner's point of view, can be from the business owner points of view, can be from the designer's point of view, and so on and so forth. So what are they viewing? They are viewing artifacts that are relevant to them. When you talk about artifacts, they can be artifacts that represents data. They can be artifacts that represents process. They can be artifacts that represents people, such as your organizational structure. They can be artifacts that represents location, for example. Okay, so all this data, process, people, location, and so on, these are abstraction. In the Zachman framework is in the columns. So the columns represents abstraction. There are six uh, columns or six abstraction following the 5W 1H structure, which are what, how, where, when, who, and why. Okay. Um, I will explain this further when we see the diagram or the framework itself. And in 1987, this is the kind of like the original Zachman framework. So you can see that we know now that Zachman framework has six columns, but here originally it has only three columns. And if you Google further, you can see that Zachman framework has many variations in terms of representing this framework. This is another. You can see that there are six columns and also six rows. Okay, so the columns are abstraction, just like I said. There are six of them: what, how, where, who, when, and why. So what represents data, and how represents function, where represents network, who represents people, and so on. For the rows, these are views or the audiences, if I may. There are six views, okay, or six audiences. When I talk about audience, so it needs to be people, right? So for the first view is from the planner's point of view. The second view is from the owner's point of view. The third view is from the designer's point of view, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in this particular diagram, we denote that the planner will gives us or only interested in knowing the scope. Okay, and for the owner, what they want to view is the business model. So you can see that the owner's model are very much business oriented. But when it comes to system model, or from the designer's point of view, or from the builder's point of view, this business oriented model or conceptual model is becoming more and more technical. In other words, from the same set of model, you can convert it, you can transform it into another set of models. The only difference is same model, but the only difference is that one model has more descriptive or has more context or has more information to the previous model. Okay. For this particular class, we are going to concentrate on the what and how column. Of course, that the idea is just for me to introduce to you what Zachman is and to practice Zachman. Um, and also, those are the two columns. For the views are only scope, the business model or the owner's point of view, the designer's point of view, and up to the extent the builder's point of view. So these are the um, the emphasis for this particular course. Okay. And if you think about it, all these cells, because of there are six rows and six columns, therefore there are 36 cells. In each of these cells are distinctly for a particular abstract and for a particular point of view. Okay, you cannot have the same model being drawn or being developed for two different views, for example. Okay, you can have the same model, but only the difference that is the level of information. And also, if you want to relate that to whatever that we have learned so far, all these cells contains models, and these models are actually artifacts, or they are actually components. They are actually artifacts, right? If you relate that to EA3 Cube framework, we know that the EA3 Cube framework has 5 levels, and each level would have components, and these components can have artifacts. It's the same here. We have 6 rows, 6 columns, and each cells here contains components or contains artifacts that you have to develop. This is another variation of Zachman framework. And I think that this is the easiest Zachman framework to see, because this particular Zachman framework relates, if you look at the cells, right, it is being mapped to a certain UML diagrams. So in this particular cell, it is actually diagrams that is quite, yeah, it can be UML diagrams, but here it is being mapped to the diagrams that you typically would hear in UML or in SDLC or in system development. So we are focusing on data and function. Data represents what? From the owner's point of view, what you need to come up with is a conceptual data model. For function, and from the owner's point of view, you're coming up with a conceptual process model. A conceptual process model is a business process model. So a business process model is basically a model that shows, business processes, things that you, basically models that you learn in your IERP. Those models where you have the steps and the arrows that link those steps together. For the designer's point of view, it's the logical data model. For the technology model or the builder's point of view, is the physical data model. Okay. For the function, for example, from the designer's point of view, this is system architecture model. If you Google this, you can find how a system architecture model looks like. All right. So this is about the system flow, the from one system sends data and information to another system, those kind of things. Okay. And as you can see that what we have learned so far in the previous slides was about the differences between the conceptual, the logical, and also the physical data model. So in order for you to understand this further, firstly, you have to know what are the differences between the conceptual, logical, and also physical data model. If you do not know what that is, you have to go back to the my previous videos and see what are the differences. So it's kind of like a prerequisite before going into Zachman. Okay. As you know that in test 2, questions about Zachman framework will be covered. I don't expect you to know each of these cells. Okay. The question in test 2 is more application, more applying Zachman. So you have to know, like, for example, draw a data model, okay, data model from the point of view of a designer. So that could be a question. So I'll give you a scenario, give you some context, and then after you have read the scenario, the question will be something like this. Draw a data model for the designer's point of view. So you should know, okay, for data designer, what kind of model that should I draw? So when you talk about model, it is your UML diagrams, right? UML diagrams consist of two types of diagrams, which is the behavioral, which is denoting process or function, and structural model, which denotes data, or the first column over here. A class diagram is an example of a structural model, or structural diagram in UML. A class diagram can be conceptual, can be logical, and also it can be physical. It can have the same class diagram. The only difference is that you put more information in logical diagram as compared to conceptual diagram. For physical diagram, it should contain more information or more technicalities as compared to the logical diagram. Okay. So for business process model, for example, you can draw a business process model is quite standard. If you Google it, you can see how this business process model looks like. But from a UML point of view, a process model is actually the activity diagram. Okay, so just concentrate on these two columns and the first 4 of the rows. And if you look at it closely again, out of all of these cells, only the first cells are lists, which means that it's not a model, it's a list of business process, a list of things important in the business, and so on and so forth. The only models are, it starts from the second row up until the rest. All right, so only the first row are in the form of a list rather than a model. All right, thank you.
I need somebody help, not just anybody.